before we begin the holiday adventure, you need to decide which of the two paths you'd like to take. So there are two different journey options. Option A is Winter Retreat, and option B is Snowbound Excursion. Each of these options has its own swatch pattern, and it gives you an example of what each of the different journeys might be like. So the patterning inside the swatch isn't necessarily the patterning that you'll be making for your project, but it does give you an idea of how those files, the different charts are presented. So I have cast on the number of stitches here that we need for our swatch, and in both cases it's the same number, 41 stitches, and then I'm working just it said work 4 rows, I worked a few more, but however many rows you want, and I just finished that row of knitting. So I want to start swatching in the round, and in order to do that, I'm going to demonstrate just using a solid yarn here, but you'll work that first row of color work, that first round of color work, and then we're going to create a loop using our yarn, because right now this goes to the ball of yarn. I'm going to make a big loop. I'm going to reconnect it onto this side of my swatch so that we can keep knitting in that direction. So we'll knit all the way across, make a giant loop, knit all the way across. That way we're knitting every round of stitches instead of knitting a row and purling a row, and we'll get a more accurate gauge swatch. So to do that, you'll work across your row, then you'll slide the work to the other side of the needle, and I like to just go ahead and get my needle in there ready to go. You'll take your yarn and make a big loop. Don't worry about using too much yarn. There's plenty of yarn. So we're gonna knit that first stitch, and I'm just holding on to that yarn that went to the big loop. And then you'll work in pattern, so you could, knit one of the main color and knit a stitch of the contrasting color. Whatever the pattern says, it has instructions, and we've thought about that to get it, to get the two yarns re-engaged. And after you've worked a few stitches, you can let go of those yarns, and then you'll continue in pattern in your chart all the way across to the other end again. So we're just pretending here that I am working in my pattern. I'm getting near the end of my stitches here, which will complete the round. Remember, we're faking our knitting in the round so that every stitch that we're doing right now is a knit stitch. So I just knit it all the way across my round. I will let go of that needle, and holding onto my work, pull the needle so that it goes to the other end. And you'll see that this first stitch here is a little loose. That's because it's connected to, remember the big loop we made? There's the big loop. We're gonna make another loop, and we're gonna knit again in another round. So I'm going into the first stitch here, making that giant loop. I'll hold on to that yarn with my left hand. You manage the yarns whatever way is comfortable for you. And then I'll begin working my pattern again. And in this case, I'm just using one yarn, but you could knit with one yarn, knit with the next yarn, and follow your chart in the same way. So again, just keep on knitting and knitting. And as we go, we are creating stockinette fabric, knit in the round. So every stitch is knit. And instead of working all the way in the round for a gauge swatch, we're using these long strands of yarn, the long loops of yarn. Again, the reason that we do this is so that when we are checking our gauge swatch, we can check the number of stitches per inch and the number of rounds per inch to make sure that we have an accurate gauge. Sometimes our purl stitches, when we're working on the wrong side of a fabric or knitting flat, that gauge can be a little bit different than if we're knitting in the round. So go ahead and complete your gauge swatch using whichever method you would like to try for your journey, whichever journey option you'd like to try. And then once you know you have a nice fabric, you like the way the fabric's looking, you understand the pattern, we're ready to cast on when the first part of the pattern arrives.